This is the Goat Bridge. It's in a kind of not ravine really, but kind of down in a little bit of a ditch and out on the outskirts of modern day Sarajevo in Bosnia Herzegovina, and it looks kind of irrelevant now. If you found yourself on it about 115 years ago, you would have found yourself kind of in the precipice between two worlds, and Europe was a bunch of different worlds, a bunch of different nationalisms and nationalities. Rivalries, imperialist, territorial claims, etc., etc. And this was dead on the precipice between two. And if you walked across the bridge this way, you would have paid a tax the way it's facing. And you would have entered the Ottoman Empire, which is the predecessor to Turkey and large parts of the modern Middle East and stuff along those lines. Where if you were standing on the area where the picture's taken, you would have found yourself in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Kind of the main power in Central Europe that's kind of starting to give way to Germany at this point, right? And these are two of the six countries that are really going to make up the massive, or seven countries, sorry, that are really going to make up the massive, massive claims of World War One, and that's what we're getting to, guys, because the story starts in the most unlikely of places, which is Sarajevo. The 20th century begins and ends here, and it's time to go ahead and start World War One, and that's what we're going to do in this lecture here. Um, Now, as we'll talk about a lot more in class, y'all, Sarajevo is a fascinating city. It's a city you may or may not have ever heard of before because it sits down in the Balkan Peninsula just above Greece. In Bosnia Herzegovina, and it was a fairly important city during the part of the 20th century, like as Yugoslavia, but it was never the capital or anything like that. And It was a fairly important city in the Ottoman Empire in the 14 and 1500s, but again, never like this massive, massive like primate city like a London or a Paris or anything like that. Really, really cool city. Love the people. People say that East meets West in Istanbul, but in all honesty, East really meets West in Sarajevo. Having been to both, that's really where you start to get a blend of Christianity and Islam. You get as you can see, it's a type of city that, and this has always been true. Like, if you eventually take my religion class, we'll even look at it as a case study. But it's the type of city where, like, you can have a church next to a mosque, next to a synagogue, and it's been that way for years, and they've gotten along in the unlikeliest of ways, right? If that makes sense. Um, And Sarajevo, and that's where we bring it up, has one of the weirdest things happen, and that the main parts of the 20th century Europe both begin and end in Sarajevo, and that events that happen in Sarajevo are going to lead up to World War One, and events that happen in Sarajevo at the very very end of the 20th century, in 92, 93, 94, 95, 96 are going to be the last major war in Europe in the 20th century, which is the Yugoslav Wars. Now, just to give you an idea, guys, this is actually where we're looking at here. Okay, this is the Balkan Peninsula. Okay, if you've looked much at it, you've probably seen like Greece and Turkey before, if that makes sense. Okay, but also making up this are Bulgaria and Romania. Okay, Albania as well. Okay, and then now, and it's actually Kosovo is actually not even on this map. It's old enough that I probably should find a newer map and put it on there. But now you've got Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Bosnia Herzegovina, Croatia, and Slovenia. And for most of the 20th century, all those put together were one country known as Yugoslavia, which means land of the South Slavs. Okay. Now, they are a bunch of different countries, as you can tell. And this one right here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Sarajevo, right there, is the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, is the one that we're concerned with and talking about right now. Okay, so back to Sarajevo, and these are just pictures that we'll talk way more about in class. You can see everything from a mosque and a church to that tall thing in the bottom left being a minaret, which is where the call to prayer comes out, which rings throughout the city enough that like all I had to do was stick my phone out the window when it was going on one time to record it. Now, having said that, you'll find versions of Islam that range from very, very conservative to incredibly liberal, to the point that I talked to a number of people who were like, yeah, the only time, if they were a woman, or like they said, like, or my mother or my girlfriend, the only time they've ever worn the headscarf is when they go into a mosque, right? Like that type of thing, right? Up in the upper left, you also find the oldest toilet in Europe, the oldest functioning toilet in Europe, which I just thought was fantastic, right? But to give you an idea, it still needs to be fairly kind of cleaned up and modernized and stuff like that from the war 25 years ago. Unemployment rate in Bosnia is upwards of 30%. And when I was last there, which at this point's been about 10 years ago or so, they had just gotten their first McDonald's. They were actually celebrating the fact that the first McDonald's in Bosnia was coming. So that gives you an idea of kind of like, attachment and I guess kind of like location in the world, if that makes sense. This is war-torn Bosnia from the or Sarajevo, from the that we'll talk way more about at the end of the year. But Europe's last major war, which actually involved rounding people up for the purposes of religious reasons and putting them in camps. And no, I'm not talking about World War II. I'm talking about something that occurred in 1994. The Yugoslav Wars occurred with Sarajevo as kind of the epicenter right here. And so you can see some of the bullet holes that were shot up. And like what, the bottom right is what used to be Sarajevo's nicest restaurant and stuff like that. And throughout the city, you see these things called Sarajevo roses right there. And those represent the time that somebody was killed by a kind of a mortar shot. So it's a fascinating city. It's a multicultural city. The food is absolutely fantastic. At least 10 of the pounds that I'm on came from Sarajevo. You guys, I guess, haven't seen me stand up on a regular basis, but that's a joke that normally lands fairly well in years where we're not on Zoom. But yeah, just absolutely fantastic food. But it's still a place that is getting itself together, if that makes sense, in a lot of different ways. And this goes back to kind of the mess that Sarajevo became very randomly throughout the course of the 20th century that started with the beginning of World War I. Although, ironically, very little of World War I actually takes place in Sarajevo at all, but the genesis of it was there. All right, guys. So what this lecture is mainly going to do is not talk about the war itself at all, aside from how it started, but really like leading up to the Great War, okay? And in case you're not aware of this, World War I, as it's known to Americans, is known to most Europeans as the Great War, okay? That's what they called it, and that's what Americans called it until we had World War II. For really weird reasons, we changed the name to World War I and called it, it seems to make sense to me, World War I and World War II, but in Britain they still call it the Great War, and then they have World War II, if that makes sense. So, like, either way, that's what you're going to entitle this, and this is what we're going to talk about here, okay? The first thing to keep in mind, and if we were in class, I'd do it this way. I'd tell you guys, hey, talk at your table groups and name like a number of different things that were going on in Europe during this time. And since we're not going to be able to do that, I'm going to have you guys just do it as we kind of go through like this, right? We've got different territorial claims, people fighting over things. Remember, you had everything from Germany picking on Denmark over like Schleswig-Holstein in order to get Austria involved and stuff like that, etc., etc. You have nationalism. You guys have done nationalism like crazy. We did that for a reason with National Romanticism. We have imperialism. You guys did that last year, okay? But either way, you've got the ideas of racism as well as the keeping up with the Joneses part of this here, right? My neighbor's got colonies, so I need colonies, which is going to lead to things like militarism and arms races, right? Which are even further things that are going on here. You've got industrialization races, and this is going to be the big thing. At this point, we are at the beginning of the 20th century, which means Britain is no longer the sole industrialized power. Every other major European nation is beginning to industrialize or has industrialized at this point, and those like Germany are just as strong as Britain. As a matter of fact, this is a lot of what this war is going to be about, Britain versus Germany, as we'll get to. We've got issues with the balance of power, guys, always wanting to be maintained and come up, like some of these alliances that we're going to see formed are going to be done because of that. And then finally, we've got old bitter disputes. We can't, ignore the fact that, by the time this thing comes around, people in other countries are going to be like, but wait, we hate Germany and Otto von Bismarck. Why? Because Bismarck's been a jerk for the last 50 years. Therefore, we're not going to trust him as far as we can throw him, even if they have different leadership and meanwhile, et cetera, right? So that doesn't help things at all either, okay? Now, as I said, there are going to be 7 key players in this, okay? And again, normally I'd have you brainstorm and talk at your table groups for this to try to remember them, but here they are in order right here. We got Germany, okay? We got Italy, bingo. We got Russia, awesome. We got the Austro-Hungarian Empire, great. We got the Ottomans. We'll talk about them in a second. We haven't really talked about them at all. And then finally, good old Britain. And finally, France. And by the way, World War I is going to represent the first time that, you have this alliance, this very, we don't love each other, but we can all deal with each other in order to maintain world peace alliance of Britain, France, and then finally joined by the United States. So Britain, France, and the United States. That really has kind of made up most of 20th century world order, if that makes sense. Okay, before we go any further, we should probably discuss this for just 2 seconds, since I brought these up, and you probably heard of everybody else in here. Okay, these fierce rivalry between key players, but maybe not the Ottoman Emperor. So here we get to, wait, who are the Ottomans? Okay, the Ottoman empires are these guys right here. You can see two maps on the side. The one up top is the Ottoman Empire at its height under Suleiman the Magnificent in 1580. Okay, it got all the way to the gates of Vienna, and it probably would have gotten further. The only reason the Ottoman Empire was stopped is that every time it made its way into Central Europe, the Europeans who were bickering with each other would just rally around the fact that the Ottomans were Muslims and they were Christian, and they'd say, wait, the Muslims are attacking us, and then all these other countries would come and help them. And so the Ottomans were always kind of stopped right around like Austria, Hungary area, etc., the middle of that. Okay, so that's back in 1580. And then the one down at the bottom right here is a map of the Ottoman Empire, which had lost a lot of land by the time World War I was coming around, right? Okay, so what was this thing? Well, it grew out of the Byzantine, okay, the Eastern Roman Empire, and it was based around Islam, okay? It was actually like one of the original, like, more modern empires based in and around the religion, right? But eventually, as it conquered and grew, it became a multinational, multilingual, multicultural power, okay? And it was one of those things that, like, without getting like super technical into it or anything like that, like there are a number of different religious rules about like the pecking order and stuff like that. And so like it was one of those things where, like, the Ottomans were always kind of on top, but then they allowed other people, including Christians and Jews. They were actually significantly more tolerant of Jews than, say, like Europeans were of Jews at that time. They allowed them into the empire and fell into kind of a thriving empire at that time, okay? But as I said, every time they made their way far enough into Europe, the Habsburgs would play the Christian versus Muslims card and get other countries involved, right? Other German, parts of like, German states or stuff along those lines to rally to them, or get the Pope involved, or declare a crusade or something like that. And so as a result, they conquered much of like the Eastern European continent, like the Caucasus, etc., and Asia, depending on where you are in geography. I don't know if that's Europe or Asia, depending on where you are, like kind of down by the Caspian Sea. Much of North Africa, for sure, part of the Arabian Peninsula, and then like much of the Balkans. And there is a huge, like, and that's why I say like Sarajevo is where East meets West. It was founded by the Ottomans, and that was part of the, like, conquered, like, kind of Balkan Peninsula by them. Now, they begin a really slow decline, starting in about like 1600 CE, and then just kind of going for, and they're known as the sick man of Europe, right? And for like 200 years, they're losing territory, they're losing power, they're losing influence, okay? And in active desperation at the end of the life, they're going to actually even go as far as to try to kill a bunch of Armenians in something known as the Armenian Genocide, and we'll talk about this at the end of World War I. But that's literally hey, the empire is falling apart and we want to distract people from something, so what can we do? And so it unfortunately leads to genocide, right? But it's had a very slow decline for a while. It's still kind of powerful. They're not really powerful, but it has Constantinople, which is a really important key city in Europe and has been in European history. Okay, the like kind of gateway to the Dardanelles and the Black Sea right there. Okay, now known as Istanbul today. Okay, and it's also got a number of people and, the control of the eastern part of the Mediterranean, so it's still important. By the end of World War I, out the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk is going to try to turn this into a secular state, and found the state of Turkey in 1923, and that's the entire point behind the state of Turkey, is that there would be a secular Muslim state in that area by Ataturk. That was his entire goal. Again, more on that later. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the Ottomans here. All right, now, back to our crisis in the Balkans here, okay? If you remember, at the very end of the last unit, when we were talking about imperialism, I had said that, like, Europe had, like, these huge land empires all over the place. Germany in Central Europe, Austria-Hungary in Central Europe, Russia in Central Europe, Britain had this naval empire, France was all over the world, etc., etc. As a matter of fact, the only place that there were a bunch of little states and stuff like that was the Balkans, right? And so, like, what this leads to, thanks to nationalism, is a bit of a crisis in the Balkans, because, like, this area used to be kept together and ruled by the, like, Austro-Hungarian, or by the Ottoman Empire. Sorry, and it's very, very politically, religiously, and culturally diverse. And they had this like whole system where like like for example in Sarajevo, like Jews got X percentage of the city, like Muslims got Y percentage of the city, Christians got Z, and they kept the peace this way, and blah 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 blah, etc. etc. As the Ottoman Empire begins to fall apart, the area that is the Balkans begins to be split by two empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Okay, and this is enough of a problem to begin with. Okay, you've got two things moving in here, but it's Europe and people wanting to maintain the balance of power and stuff along those lines. Okay. So it's not only that part of it, okay, but with burgeoning nationalism, you also have all these countries up top: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, Macedonia, etc., plus all those wanting to not be conquered by the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. And you have the fact that like this is historically not as rich of an area as the rest of Europe, and it's historically been conquered by those areas. And so like the further ideas of Giuseppe Mazzini and a young, vibrant working class, right, that could lead to a sense of belonging is burgeoned even further then. Because for a second, okay, instead of not only do you have like the strong and working class thinking, hey, I'm Serbian, or hey, I'm Bosnian, or hey, I'm Macedonian, but they also have a, hey, I'm those things, and now let's get rid of the Ottomans and let's get rid of the like Austro-Hungarians, etc., which is something that like say Italy doesn't have. They have, hey, I'm Italian and that's awesome and we're great and that's cool and let's conquer things, but not the vehement kind of like, let's get rid of them, if this makes sense. Okay. And this whole thing had led to a series of like minor wars, something called the Russo-Turkish War. Okay. A series of like geopolitical messes and stuff like that. Okay. The 1878, Otto von Bismarck sits everybody down, the seven big powers, and he says, we need to resolve the mess that's the Balkans, okay? And like sort this whole thing out. Now, this is not to be confused with the Berlin Conference, the whole thing where they divided up Africa. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure Bismarck did this just to piss off like history students 150 years later, right? This is the Congress of Berlin, okay? Where instead of sitting down and dividing up Africa, they're going to sit down and divide up the Balkans, or at least sort this out, etc., okay? And Bismarck just really invited those seven countries: Germany, Italy, Russia, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Britain, and France, okay? And their goal, ostensibly, was to sort out the Russo-Turkish War. Russia and the Ottoman Empire, but you can even see the influence with Turkey and stuff like that, and Ataturk and stuff like that. It's already being started to call Turkey, that area is, even though Turkey, the state, does not exist. Turkey, the geopolitical place, does. And they'd gotten into war over some of the Balkan areas, particularly in like, shipping rights in the Black Sea and through that strait and the Dardanelles and the map and stuff like that. And so the goal is to sort that out, okay? But Bismarck has two kind of side goals here. Side goal number one is to quote unquote protect Christian Europeans from the Ottoman Empire. Now that one's kind of a false one there, but that allows people to draw up religious terms and nationalism, and possibly Bismarck have countries on his side like Austria. Well, they actually probably normally get Austria. Sorry, like Russia that he might not normally get against the Austrian Empire or stuff like that, to align themselves with that, and to align themselves against what has historically been like a number of religious like fighting and stuff like that. The bigger one though is the one that's lifted first, and that is to cripple this idea of Pan-Slavism, okay, and Russia. And Pan-Slavism is this idea that that the Eastern peoples of Europe should kind of band together. Historically, you had people like you had Mediterranean peoples, you had like Nordic peoples, you had Aryans, etc., and those in the Eastern Europe were actually called like Slavs, and that's kind of like from like Poland kind of east over. So like that whole like area where like the really fertile area, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, parts of the Balkans, like kind of like Croatia was not really Slavic, Slovakia was not really Slovenia was not really Slavic, but like Bosnia has some Slavic influence. But by the time you get to Serbia, by the time you get to Serbia and Romania and Bulgaria and places like that, All those are mainly ethnically Slavic, okay? And what Russia had done is Russia had said, hey, we're a huge Slavic empire. And, following ideas of social Darwinism and groups of people kind of like, banding in kind of like tribal things and ethnic groups and stuff like that, we want to promote this idea of pan-Slavism, that like there should be a large Slavic state with all the Slavs working together, possibly against other people, etc., etc., but with all the Slavs working together with Russia kind of at the helm. And Bismarck sees this, as do others, as a gross violation of the balance of power. And part of what he wants to do is cripple this idea of Pan-Slavism so that Russia can't take over or have hegemony in large parts of Eastern Europe like that. So what's going to happen? Okay, what he's going to do, or what they're going to do at the Congress of Berlin, is they're first going to decide that a number of different kind of movements go on here. Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, Romania, all those guys are given independence, right? In order to kind of break it up a little bit and stuff like that, Macedonia is going to be given to the Ottomans. Bosnia and Herzegovina is going to be given to the Austrians. Britain is going to sneak in there and get Cyprus, because Britain's really good at sneaking in and getting things it wants out of treaties and say, hey, we can use that to keep the peace. And the Ottomans are going to promise many reforms. The end result is, instead of actually creating Bismarck thinks he's created a balance there, but he really hasn't, because Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, Romania, etc., are going to get feelings of nationalism and get bigger and want to what was I going to say, kind of grow the size of their countries, whereas the others, like Bosnia and Macedonia, are going to feel like they got screwed over and they didn't get their independence and they're conquered. And so the end result is that that's not really going to please anybody, but it's going to kind of really change the geopolitical landscape of the Balkans. Okay. Now, with that supposedly out of the way, okay, Otto von Bismarck's machinations are still going to lead us hardcore down the path to World War I here, okay? Because Bismarck says, okay, I've sorted out the Balkans, we're sorting out Berlin, or we're sorting out Africa and the Berlin Conference, etc., etc. Now I need to make sure that Germany is kind of dominant throughout Europe, if that makes sense, okay? And Bismarck's going to turn to his kind of eastern flank, and he's going to see France as the biggest threat there. Okay, he sees France as the biggest land threat to Europe. He knows that on the international scale, Britain is the biggest threat, right? But France has the biggest land army. They're the dominant army of Europe. They historically have been. They get a crappy vibe after World War II. But historically, France has been the army you don't beat, or you don't fight because you can't beat them. Etc., etc., and he wants to try to isolate France, okay? And he's going to create a series of alliances to do this, okay? And he's going to find allies in Austria, Hungary, and Italy, and he's going to create something known as the Triple Alliance, okay? This is going to be part of the sides of World War I here, okay? So Austria, Hungary, and Italy are going to lead to something called the Triple Alliance. He's going to try really hard to get Russia involved as well, but Russia's going to say they want to back out, right? So at this point, Britain has, and this is eventually going to be, or not Britain, sorry, Bismarck has, and this is eventually going to be known as the Central Powers, okay? An alliance in the middle of Europe that involves Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Germany. And what they've said is that, hey, we're all together in this, an attack on one is an attack on all, etc., etc. Now, when the war actually starts, Italy's not going to be involved in this. Italy is going to leave, okay? They're going to say that the alliance was for defensive purposes, and the Ottoman Empire is going to be added to the alliance. Okay, Italy will eventually get back on the war in this other side, right? But for a while, Italy's neutral. Anyway, so later on, the Central Powers is going to be Austria, Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. But originally, the alliance that starts this whole thing is Austria, Hungary, Italy, and Germany. And the reason I say starts this whole thing is Britain and France are going to look around and say, ooh, you know what? We don't like each other very much, but we like Germany even less, so let's ally together to, stop the balance of power here. By the way, before we go any further, I want you guys to see this, that all of these guys are very closely related. There's been so much inbreeding in the families at this point, and as I think I pointed out to you earlier in class when we were talking about this, every European family at this point, every European royal family, is related to Queen Victoria in some way, except for the Dutch royal family. That's like how much inbreeding and kind of ridiculous this got at this point. And the reason I bring this up is during World War One, we're going to have Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, George V of England, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who are all cousins, as you can see on this family tree through the Danish royal and British royal families here. They're actually going to all grow up together, and they're going to grow up playing war games together in their backyard, and now they're about to play a huge war, not game, but war, with the people of Europe in their backyard, literally there. And it's really interesting. You can even see kind of the familiar resemblances between Georgie and Nicky right there. They actually called each other, and that's why I say that, Willie, Nicky, and Georgie. And throughout the course of the war, they will write letters to each other. Things like, I can't believe you did this. Your empire is like screwing me over, blah, blah, blah. Please give mother our best and kiss the kids for me, your beloved cousin Georgie. Stuff like that, okay? So while this is really still just kind of, a large part of this has to do with the machinations of the upper class and kind of how they mess with the people down at the bottom, and that's the other reason I'm kind of bringing this up. Okay, now, when Kaiser Wilhelm I dies, Kaiser Wilhelm II becomes Kaiser, and he kicks out Otto von Bismarck, which is a huge mistake. Wilhelm II is greedy, and he thinks he's politically savvy, and he's really not. And with Wilhelm I done and Bismarck out, Britain and France see this as an opportunity to counterbalance themselves against Germany. Okay. And they sit there and say, okay, as I said, we don't really like each other very much, but we like Germany a lot less, and we're not so afraid of Bismarck anymore because he's gone. So let's go ahead and sign this alliance to make sure Germany doesn't get any stronger with this new group of people, etc., right? And in 1907, Britain and France are going to sign an alliance called the Triple Entente. Okay, and Georgie and Nicky were very close. Nicky and Willie bickered a lot anyway. This is why I brought up the whole family relationships. And so Britain is going to be able to go to Russia, and they're going to get Russia involved. Okay, and Europe is now firmly divided into two alliances, with Britain, France, and Russia on one side and the Triple Entente, and Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy on the other side, and the Triple Alliance. Guys, if you ever need to remember the sides for for either of the world wars, just always remember it's East and West against the middle. Okay, does that make sense? Like, it's always the East and the West against the middle. And part of what that's going to do in both world wars is hem the middle in. Okay, as you can see even right now, Germany is going to have to fight a two-front war. They're going to be attacked by Britain and France on one side and Russia on the other side, and that's going to be a big, big, big problem when this thing starts. Okay, all these alliances are all set and stuff like that, okay? And the last thing we need to do is you guys need to understand the feelings of nationalism in Serbia in order to understand how this thing went out, okay? Because with these 7 big powers like this, okay, Serbia, which historically has been kind of the largest ethnic group and the power in the Balkans or stuff like that, begins to look around and starts to say, hey, maybe we could become the major player, like an 8th major big state within the Balkans, if this makes sense. Okay, they believe that because Serbs have moved all throughout the land, so you have Serbia in that area, and they're going to call the whole Balkans Greater Serbia. Okay, they're going to say, hey, there's ethnic Serbs in there, so therefore we should do things with this, and we should make sure to unite this into one big country, and blah blah blah. This is all feelings of nationalism and imperialism right now, guys. This is really important because this idea that Serbia has the right to rule parts of the Balkans because of this is going to be directly what leads to the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, 100 years almost later as well. Okay. So Serbia believes it's their right to kind of unite the lands and they can be a major player in Europe, okay? And they also don't trust the Austro-Hungarian Empire to stop at Bosnia and Herzegovina. They don't believe that, like, in 20, 30 years they won't invade and try to take over Belgrade and other parts of the Balkans and stuff like that, okay? And what this rhetoric in Serbia does, with Serbian politicians drumming this up, is it leads to a number of extremist groups, okay? And the most famous of which is a terrorist group known as the Black Hand. Okay, and the Black Hand determines that they're going to do something really violent in Bosnia and Herzegovina in order to get the Serbians there to revolt and to help Bosnia and that province join Serbia. Okay. So what do? Well, when we're in class, I'm going to sit here and take, a solid 20 minutes to tell you one of the funniest coincidences in history that involves a couple misfired guns, a botched parade, an accidental sandwich shop, and a bridge, etc., etc. Okay? But to make that really, 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 really long story and interesting story short, the dude on the upper left, a dude by the name of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is due to come with his wife Sophie, that's the woman on the right, to Sarajevo to review the troops for a military parade. And the Black Hand decides they are going to assassinate him. And the man in the middle, a man by the name of Gavrilo Princip, is the person who will eventually be the one who does it. When he does it, he will do it through, as I said, a long story short, an accidental parade route. And by the way, you can see all the McDonald's signs. I told you they were getting the first McDonald's last time I was here in this picture. An accidental parade route takes a wrong turn onto this bridge, known as the Latin Bridge right here. And Princip, at the place where it says museum, will step out of a sandwich shop on June 28th, 1914. He will see that the person he's been trying to figure out how to assassinate the entire day, I told you there were a series of events that led him not able to do it, and then one coincidence that led it to happen, is right there. And on this spot, Gavrilo Princip will shoot Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia. Sophia will die instantly. Franz Ferdinand probably could have been saved, but he was a vain man, so he had his military jacket on really tight, and so they weren't able to rip it open to get to the wound as much as they wanted to, and he bled out as well. He's going to shoot him with literally that gun, number 12, right there, just so you know. Okay, again, all these things are things that if you're in class and we're going through, I'll talk about and stuff like that, and these are things that are, make up the entire story in the museum and stuff like that. Way, just while we're at it here, and again, this will be a lot funnier in class and stuff like that. Here is a reenactment of said shooting. I was on this tour with this dude Nano right here, who's this Bosnian history student actually, and he was really enjoying the fact that he had a history teacher on tour and stuff like that. So he had somebody who talked to him a lot, and so when we got there, he was like, "We really should reenact the shooting." And so since, Princip was Serbian and he's Bosnian, meaning they're both from that general area, and I look white enough to be Franz Ferdinand, I decided to do that. So here is a reenactment of the shooting for you. You can use your imagination beyond that. All right, now, the Great War actually go over this, because this series of events is going to lead us to this thing hardcore. Okay, Franz Ferdinand, the Black Hand, settle on assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Okay, a series of errors leads them to be killed finally on June 28th, 1914. Keep in mind, Franz Ferdinand is the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian Black Hand member, assassinates them. So, Austria uses this as a chance to make a ridiculous ultimatum to Serbia, basically saying, hey, Serbia, if you do not arrest the Black Hand, send us a bunch of money, round up all these people. And then the last one is something insane, allow our troops to come into Belgrade to make sure the peace is okay. And Serbia's like, if their troops come into Belgrade and we just let them in, they're never going to leave. They're just going to annex Belgrade and take it over. So they make this ridiculous ultimatum, and Serbia says no. However, before Serbia says no, and this is where the alliances and everything we've talked about is really about to kick in right here, Serbia is going to go to Russia. This is Pan-Slavism, and say, hey, Russia, you're Slavs, we're Slavs, they're not Slavs, you've been promoting Pan-Slavism. If we get attacked, will you back us? And Russia says yes. Okay? Now, at this point, things are escalating. This has been about a week now, and this is really important, because Germany is actually going to step in and say, hey, guys, everybody just chill. Nobody needs to start anything right now. Everybody chill out. Okay? This is going to matter a lot, because at the end of the war, when people are trying to get revenge on Germany, they're going to blame Germany for starting the war. And Germany did not start the war in any way whatsoever. Okay? Again, that might not matter that much, but any historian worth their weight in salt will tell you that the problems at the end of World War I are directly what led to World War II. So it does matter quite a lot. So at this point, Germany says, hey guys, chill. But Germany also makes another mistake. Okay? Germany says, hey, chill. And then the Kaiser takes the worst time vacation in the history of the world. He takes a 2-week vacation on his yacht in the North Sea. Okay. And before he leaves, Austria-Hungary goes to him and says, hey, if this leads to war while you're on vacation and we attack, will you back us? And this is the thing historians do point to for saying, all right, Germany did make some mistakes to cause the war, even though they told people to chill. Because at this point, Germany gives Austria a blank check. They basically say, that's what it's called. It's called the blank check. They say, yeah, we'll back you. No problem. We've got this alliance. We'll back you, etc., etc. Later on, they said they did it without thinking. They didn't think it would actually come to anything, but they do agree to back them, and then the Kaiser goes on vacation. Bam. A couple days later, Austria attacks. Russia backs Serbia. Okay? But wait for it. Remember the whole alliance thing? France says Russia's backed Serbia and Austria's attacked Serbia, which means Austria's attacked Russia. So now France is going to back Russia. And now Germany is going to back Austria. Trigger, trigger, trigger. Alliances kick in. Italy says, you know what? We're not involved in this thing. This was a defensive war, and Austria attacked, so we're getting out. And Ottoman says, you know what? Actually, we'd like to get in because we lost the Russo-Turkish War to Turkey. Remember that slide about 4 or 5 things ago with the Congress of Berlin? So let's jump in and let's help. So they jump in, okay, to do this thing, okay, and now war's on. And you'll notice the one country that's not really involved in this thing yet is Britain at all, and this is going to be a big thing. Now, Germany had been preparing for this for a long time. A dude by the name of Alfred von Schlieffen and come up with a plan. It's a kind of complicated plan, but for your line, or for your not lines, for your purposes, you basically need to think of it this way. Germany realizes they're going to be attacked by both sides, and the idea is attack and deal with France really quickly first, and then we can deal with Russia first. So the line is Paris for lunch and Moscow, or St. Petersburg as it would have been then, because that would have been the capital, St. Petersburg for dinner, okay? And so Germany has an idea for this that involves the Schlieffen Plan, and that's what they're going to put in line, okay? Now, France is aware of this, and they've built something that will eventually be known as the Maginot Line, okay? And this is a line that goes right down the border of Germany and France. So Germany could walk around this very easily, okay, and avoid it entirely. But to do that, they'd have to walk through Belgium, okay? Now, Britain has a long history of being very, very close, both like, blood relation, etc., as well as like politically to the Belgian royal family. And they have a long promised thing that they will protect Belgium if this is actually a thing. Germany does not think Britain will go to war over a scrap of paper. That is a direct quote. And so Germany invades France around the Maginot Line via Belgium, and bam, Britain turns around and declares war on Germany. And now here we are. This thing is in full swoop. World War I has begun all over an assassination in Sarajevo. As I said, this thing is East-West versus Central. Okay, you've got two teams right here. Okay, Britain along with Belgium, France, Russia, and Serbia. Belgium and Serbia aren't that really a big deal. Okay, those guys, what was the Triple Entente is now going to be known as the Allies. Okay, and just to confuse you, what was the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, is now going to be known as the Central Powers. Okay, and World War I is ready to begin in earnest. Map of this thing right here, and this is the last thing we're going to look at. Okay, and you can see an eastern front on one side over by Russia and stuff like that where we'll be fighting, a western front on the other side where most of the carnage is going to take place, a clear division between the people in the central versus like the two kinds kind of hemming it in, and now everybody's willing to dig in. And the general consensus amongst people at this time, and this starts in June and they're excited to go off to war in August, is that the war will be over by Christmas. Not because like they'll be able to sort it out, because they feel like they've gotten so much new technology in the last few years that they'll blow each other up so profoundly that this thing will just be completely over and done and the winter will be sorted out by Christmas. And so they assume that there will be a short war and the boys will be home soon. How wrong they are. All right, y'all, we will leave it there for today. We will pick back up more with the war as we go along here and stuff like that. Have a good one, and I will talk to you guys soon.